So I think we're ready to start. All right, so I just wanted to say, first of all, welcome to everybody. This is the first webinar that ICSR is hosting. So I'm really excited to be able to be a part of it and to have this conversation with Alex about his new book, Incitement. Obviously, ICSR, like many other organizations, has had to adapt to the new realities that we're living in today, post-COVID, having to sort of go online and virtual with everything. So bear with us if there are any technical difficulties or anything like that. It is our first time doing it, so bear with us, but I'm really excited about the great turnout that we have. We have over 100 people who have signed up on this call, which I think actually is a great testament, Alex, to you and your book and how excited people are to hear from you. Very quickly before we start, I want to say a quick thank you to Johanna, who is the acting director of ICSR and who really did an amazing job in putting this whole event together and a bunch of other stuff behind the scenes. So thank you, Johanna. Thank you, Shiraz, director of ICSR, and thank you, Alex, for being here. Okay, so Alexandra Meleagrou-Hitchens, a lecturer at King's College and the research director at the program on extremism at George Washington University. You've also just released your book, Incitement, about Anwar Al-Awlaki, who is widely thought of as being one of the most effective recruiters of jihadists in recent times. So I'm excited to delve into that with you. But I want to say a few words about you first, Alex, just for people who might not know. You used to work at ICSR. In fact, you were part of the original team that really helped establish the center and expand it and really make it what it is today. So you have a long history with ICSR. And in fact, this book is, as I understand it, a culmination of the research that you started at ICSR years ago. And I have to tell you that I really think this is a pioneering work in this field. I think everyone interested in this topic, have a copy of your book. I highly recommend it. It was really fascinating to read. And so with that, I'll just, I wanted to say one thing before we started the conversation, which is for everybody who's watching, there's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. So you can just click that button and type in any questions that you have as we're having this conversation. And I don't want you to feel like you have to wait until the end of the talk or anything like that to ask your question. Just as we're having the conversation, I do want this to be interactive and as close to an actual in-person discussion as we can, given the circumstances. So just ask your questions, and then as I'm talking with Alex, I will be looking at the Q&A tab and I'll bring in your questions as we go through the conversation. So with that, Alex, I just wanted to ask you, I mean, obviously the first question that pops into my mind when I pick up this book is why Anwar Al-Awlaki? Why him? I mean, there are so many figures over the last few years that have been in the news and that have had an impact in this, this world of kind of, jihadist activity, terrorism, recruitment. So why him? Why were you so interested in him, and why did you decide to write a whole book about it?
Yeah, you're right. There are a lot of options out there when you want to look at sort of jihadism in the West and important people involved in it. I suppose really initially when I was a sort of young researcher at ICSR and also a little bit before at a couple of policy think tanks, a lot of the work I did was getting a better understanding of both sort of Islamist activism in the West, but also more violent jihadist activism, and getting to understand that world, back in 07, 08, maybe a little bit earlier even. The name Anwar Al-Awlaki kept coming up across the spectrum, right? So it wasn't just jihadists who were talking about it. It wasn't just Islamists, and in fact, it wasn't even just these two type of activist groups. It was also just your normal Muslims who are following their religion, who don't speak Arabic, so follow in English. So he was coming up across all these different communities and groups of people. So that was interesting, the fact that he was able, and this is partly explains his later popularity, or his popularity at the time, was his ability to really appeal to such a wide range of groups. So really that was how I came across when I thought I need to understand what made this guy so popular across the spectrum. And also, what is he doing differently from other English-speaking jihadist preachers? By this time, he was openly jihadi in 07, 08. What made him different from this, the other English-speaking jihadist preachers who preceded him? And I wanted to try to get a sense of what that was about, and what was it he was able to do that they weren't doing to communicate jihadism to audiences, culturally Western audiences, English-speaking audiences. So that was really the main reason why, was just that curiosity and the fact that, unlike others, you couldn't really pigeonhole him or categorize him very effectively, as ideologically, but which is something I tried to certainly do in the book. And the first part of the book is really an exercise in trying to place him in this spectrum of both wider Islamic thought, but also Salafi and Islamist activist thought. And so, yeah, much of the beginning of the book is tries to categorize him as well as possible, while acknowledging it's a very loose set of categories and blurry lines everywhere, really.
One thing that I thought was really interesting when I was reading the book about him is that when you describe how he was in the beginning, before he kind of turned into this extremist figure that he ended up being, as I was reading about it, it almost sounded like people that I know. I mean, he, just very kind of mainstream, very well respected and very popular among mainstream Muslims, mainstream Muslim institutions, and just kind of, as I was reading that, and then his transformation, especially after 9/11, and I think, interestingly, you said that he wasn't initially very quick to support the 9/11 attacks, right? I mean, it took him a while to kind of get to the place. So it's not like this was someone who just kind of came out right off the bat, was extremist, angry, and decided to do this. I mean, he had, for someone who helped people go through their own evolution, extremism, he seems to have gone through his own evolution. So I was just so fascinated by that, because it seemed to me that could happen to anybody. So can you tell us a little bit more about why you think it happened to him and how?
Yeah. So that's the other reason, by the way, that I found him interesting, is that you can sort of trace his own progression to some extent, his intellectual progression. And I described the book not as a biography, but really as an intellectual history, particularly the first half for him. And yes, certainly, for those of you who are, for those in the audience who aren't aware entirely of his history, we're talking about someone who in the mid and late 90s was incredibly influential in American Islam and in English, and in Islam and English. And he held a number of pretty high profile and well-respected positions, including Imam at the Dar al-Hijra Mosque in Virginia, and he was even invited to go speak at the Pentagon after 9/11 to discuss Islam and the future of Islam in the West and all this. So he was incredibly popular early on, and really for people of our generation, and particularly if you came from a family that wasn't very religious, so you didn't have a very big religious background, he was very attractive to that age group. And I think really people of our age, who you could categorize as not being very religious, and who had some kind of religious awakening later on, very likely the person that they would have been listening to would have been him. So that's how popular he was. And one of the things he did that hadn't really been done in this mid-90s period was he was translating really almost all of his work is not what we would describe as scholarly work or looking at the so-called Islamic sciences, but it was basically Sirah. It was history. It was sort of prophetic histories that were not really available in English. So histories of both the Prophet, but also of his closest companions that had been circulating for centuries in some cases in Arabic, but not really available in English. So he took those Sirah and he translated them into English, and really and if you speak to influential American Muslims of the time and who continue to be today, they said that many of them have told me that that was not that really wasn't available in English until he did it. So not only did he translate it, and this is a type of, Sirah and the study of it is probably one of the lightest lifts intellectually. It's not like studying Hadith or Quran, right? It's not there's not as much of a discipline in this. It's more of a storytelling. And it's not very well sourced either. In fact, less so say than with the Hadith, you have to have the chains of transmission and proof of, who said what, when. With the Sirah, you don't need any of that. So it was easy to access for people intellectually, and it was also easy to manipulate whichever way you want. And a lot of people are suspicious of people who focus on Sirah, because if you only do Sirah, it usually means you've got an agenda you're trying to tack on to this story you're telling. So, and in that storytelling, things come out in those that I identify early on in his work that suggests that if the situation for Muslims were to change and feel more threatening in the future, so may his own views on what Muslims should do about it and how they should react. And so there are early signs in his work that I think, and admittedly in hindsight looking at it, that kind of were red flags. And I think very early on, we saw someone, again, in his early work who viewed the West and Western culture and secularism with both fear and contempt. He saw them as incredibly threatening to Islam and to Islamic identity in the West in particular. He was very afraid of American Muslims, Western Muslims, having their Islamic identity subsumed by Western culture and pop culture. And so he didn't see Western secularism as this sort of benign threat, but a very direct metastatic threat to them. And that was designed to be a threat. So, and he viewed the world in that very basic way, black and white, Muslim, non-Muslim. That's how he started out. And that, many people view the world like that and they don't become jihadists. So, that's not to explain it, but it's to say that was the starting off point for him. And in the midst of all that, so as he tells the Sirah, as he tells the stories of Muhammad and these histories, he ties it in with modern things that are going on. So that was one, and things that are going on in the lives of his American audience. So not only was he translating, he was making it accessible to them, speaking to them, resonating to them. And there were other little things that he would refer to and say that if you really listen closely and with a trained ear, and again, admittedly in hindsight, are further red flags. And other things that I noticed was a pretty heavy reliance on a fairly narrow set of Islamist intellectuals, particularly Sayyid Qutb, Abu Alam Maududi. He certainly had taken on interpretation of Islam that were very influenced by those kind of thinkers, so viewing Islam as this kind of political project and solution to all the world's problems, at the very least to all the Muslim world's problems. So we had someone who I categorized early on in the book as a sort of lightweight Salafi with quite strong Islamist influence. So theologically, he wanted to present himself physically as well. He dressed as a Salafi, and he wanted people to emulate the Salaf, Muhammad and his followers in those first 3 generations. But he also infused that with Islamist activist thought, which, arguably, those two things together, Salafi theology and Islamist ideology, in the right context, the right time, brought together, create Salafi jihadism, to put it simply. I mean, there's a lot more around that story, but, and so Al-Awlaki, I say sort of early on, started off as a sort of activist Salafi, if we were to say, in those 3 categories of Salafism. And my argument essentially is that as the world around him changes, as the war on terror takes pace or speeds up, as the aftermath of 9/11 begins to become clear, his views became more hardened. They didn't change drastically, but they became more hardened. And particularly the main view on the biggest change wasn't really in his ideology and in his interpretation of Islam, but really was on its implementation and how it should be implemented, right? And he started off by saying, join the activist groups, join sort of Muslim Brotherhood aligned organizations in the United States that don't call for jihad, but call for a kind of collective identity and activism. And he went from that to saying, actually, none of that's going to work now. We have to fight jihad. But that was, he was able to kind of take things he already had taught and discussed and just change the tone a little bit, rather than, it wasn't some drastic 180. Rather, it was an evolution towards, and my wider argument is, when you have the quietist apolitical Salafis, the ones who are taking their line from the Saudi establishment, what goes on in the world of geopolitics, barely registers for them, right? It's not something that they're very interested in. It doesn't impact their core creed or really their core methodology. They're kind of siloed from all that. The activist Salafis, the ones who open themselves up to the kind of undulations of geopolitics, their methodologies are very much more subject to change depending on how they view the world and how they view the threat to Islam. And for Al-Awlaki after 9/11, quite soon after, within 2 to 3 years, that the way the world shaped up for Muslims, both domestically and abroad, to him made him conclude pretty quickly that violent jihad was the only way to do it. And he already had a fairly strong ideological underpinning to kind of argue that. But crucially, unlike the other jihadist English-speaking preachers, he had spoken about Islam much more widely. With the other jihadists, guys like Abdullah al-Faisal and Omar Bakri Muhammad, Anjem Chowdhury, these other types, that's all they talked about ever. You could always say, okay, that guy's a jihadi preacher. That's what they were only ever going to have a very small constituency of people interested in them. Al-Awlaki started off with a much broader discussion of Islam, and a much broader base of support. And so he was much more effectively able to present jihad as an integral component of the religion, rather than someone who's just pushing only jihad. So it made it seem way more legitimate, and it really helped to explain to his Western followers how jihadists view, jihadism jihad as the kind of core component of worship, rather than, but also as a wider, part of the wider faith. And he was really effective at doing all that.
Yeah, and I think, part of what I understood as I was reading the book, exactly to what you're saying, part of the reason why he was so effective at that, and I want to get, in a minute, I'm just going to ask you about, so, now we're talking about sort of what he tried to do, but now I want to ask you about how he did it and how he went about it. But before that, I just, it was really interesting to me what you said about him kind of not being really bogged down with he wasn't a scholar, he wasn't a Muslim scholar, he wasn't some learned, sheikh or something. He was just kind of like a lay person almost, who was talking about these issues in a way that was really relatable to the average Muslim. And it also helped him to escape. He could kind of shift as necessary without being bogged down by one school of thought or one, ideology or anything like that. So just as an example from him going to not necessarily supporting the 9/11 attacks to kind of going into what he became, he wasn't bogged down by any sort of identity, right, that he had to follow. He was really able to kind of shift. And I thought that was really interesting and unique about him, and something that I thought that you brought out quite well in the way that you wrote about him. The other thing that I thought was interesting that you said, because again, we see so many people talking about, all of these grave insults against the Muslim world and how the Muslim world has been under attack for years. But very often it sort of just feels like an idea, like you're just talking about this concept that Muslims have been under threat. It seemed to me also from the way you wrote about Anwar Al-Awlaki is that he was able to not just create a direct threat in people's minds, but it was very urgent as well. It was something that couldn't wait. It was something that had to be dealt with now. Not something that you sit around in a cafe and complain about with your friends, but it was actually something, he turned it into something actionable, which I thought was interesting. So I wanted to ask you about how he was able to do that, because it does actually take some skill, in fact, a lot of skill probably, to turn someone from an armchair kind of complainer about the West and the things that the West does to Muslims into someone who is actually literally willing to get up and do something about it. And you mentioned 3 specific examples of people who did something about it. They did something in very different ways, right? And we'll get into that in a minute. But in terms of how, I just want to read a couple of quotes from your book that I thought really kind of nailed it for me in terms of why you thought he was able to do that, to create action and a sense of urgency in people. So you say that so Haroro Ingram talks about people like Al-Awlaki, and you mentioned him in your book as saying, he just explains that people like Al-Awlaki he calls them architects of identity. And you said that that's exactly what Al-Awlaki did. You said that he was able to create meaning for people, to people who didn't even maybe know that they were lacking meaning in their lives. He was able to create that meaning for them and then get them to capitalize on it and act on it. And you say that, and this I thought was very fascinating because it seems like such a difficult thing to do. You say that he allowed them, I mean, his followers, people that he listened to, or that listened to him, he allowed them to feel a sense of personal agency in their decision making, right? And in a world where you just, you know, you can feel so helpless about things, that for him to be able to make people feel, I am making my own decision, I have agency, and I have power. I mean, how was he able to do that?
Yeah, no, that's really, I'm glad that you've really picked up on a lot of the key stuff I wanted to get across in the book, and really great observations there. Going back to your initial point about him not getting bogged down in the kind of intra-Muslim debates and discussions and criticism, he was able to rise above it, partly because what he focused, as I mentioned, he focused on Sirah, right? Lives of the Prophet, lives of Muhammad, life of Umar bin Khattab, life of these people who you're not going to get any pushback from anyone about those guys being great and about them being important, you know, in the religion. So he focused on a pretty uncontroversial topic, which is, let's look at the Prophet and his history and that of his companions and learn from it. There's no Muslim's going to tell you that's you know, wrong, so you know, he was able to please everyone really with that approach. And then he could, as you said, he could shape shift as he needed, and he didn't focus. You know, one of the big things that kind of ruined Salafism in America was, in the end, the obsessive definition of who was and was not Muslim, and a real big process of, if not excommunication, you know, shunning of Muslims who they believe were not following the correct interpretation as set out by the Saudi sheikhs in particular. So a lot of American conservative Islam was really defined by a lot of this, as I said, not quite takfir, but you know, on the edge of it. Al-Awlaki never really did any of that. He never told anyone they weren't the proper Muslim, particularly early on. He didn't focus very much on that kind of thing. And even later on, one of the things, you know, Al-Awlaki, even his jihadi work, did very little focus on takfir and excommunication of Muslims. It was more about getting people in rather than defining who they weren't. So that helped him really keep you know, really cast a very wide net as far as who he could attract. And the Sirah storytelling component is actually also helps explain or answer your other questions, which is this issue of how did he create a sense of urgency. Right. And there's a few ways he did this. And early on in the book, I set out the kind of theoretical parameters. It's not a theory-heavy book, but there are some tools I've used really from what more widely is referred to as social movement theory, which is essentially a set of theories and ideas and tools that try to explain what gets people off, you know, like you said, out of the house, on the streets, and one way or the other mobilizing in the cause of a movement. And that, when we talk about social movements, we can talk, you know, all sorts, you know. You could probably categorize Black Lives Matter as a social movement, and you could also categorize something as extreme as the Jihad movement as a social movement. So it you know, it's not a moral or a sort of tag. It's just a way of describing groups of people who have maybe a shared collective identity making demands on the state. And usually those are done in non-violent ways, protests and things like that. But they can also be done in violent ways. And terrorism can be seen as just the most extreme form of collective action undertaken by social movements. So anyway, one of the things that I explained in terms of how Al-Awlaki transmitted or communicated all this was he was able to use, you know, something that is referred to in the literature as framing, which essentially is based on the theory that people act on the basis of a reality that has been created for them by what you can call a movement entrepreneur, someone like Al-Awlaki. They create meaning through the way they present events. So very simply, one of the first things that you've got to do is you've got to identify the problem and the cause of the problem that this group has. And you've got to diagnose it. And, you know, very simply, the main problem is that there's a conspiracy taking place and it's a war on Islam, right? That's the meta narrative, right? But you've got to make that relevant to audiences that aren't living in a world where the war on Islam is an easy sell. You know, if someone's living in Iraq or Afghanistan after 9/11, fairly easy to sell that conspiracy theory to them if they just had their house blown up by a bomb that they didn't even see dropped, or, you know. So to get an American to start believing a war on Islam is real and is a direct threat to them takes a whole different approach, and something that only someone like Al-Awlaki could do, because he had to know the ideas, he had to know the religion, but he also had to know the concerns that the audience, Americans. So through his ability to frame the threat as more of a, he was very effective at bending them to actually act. And, you know, more specific, how do you sell the war to an American? Well, you've got to find examples from their life that they may have been realized are an example of threat, and kind of reframe those. So very the classics, you know, you're well aware of classic discussion after 9/11 about very well balanced discussion and not well framed about how do we respond to extremist Islam, say, you know, radical Islam or jihadism or whatever. And there's this constant debate still going on and been going on for a long time. Do we empower moderates, right? Moderate Islam versus whatever extremist Islam. And how do we, you know, beat the bad guys with the good Muslims, right? And it's not it's a debate that's fraught with a lot of issues, but it's a debate that anyone who's even sort of tangentially followed this will be aware of. And Al-Awlaki was able to say, look, you know, this whole discussion about moderate Islam and that's going on in the West today, really that's part of the war on Islam, actually. Because what they're trying to do is they're trying to redefine the religion. They're trying to remove its more problematic components like jihad and like, you know, Islamic law as some, you know, interpreted by some. And they're trying to remold it in their image of secularism. They're trying to essentially ruin it ideologically. So really he's saying, yeah, there's this physical war on Islam taking place that's not really threatening you too much, particularly not in a warfare sense. But there's an ideological war on Islam that's happening on your doorstep, and the next step is going to be the physical one. Right. And so that was the way to kind of put it on their front doorstep. And so you create a sense of immediacy and also then urgency through things like this. But how else do you create that urgency and that sense of wanting to act? And you do it. And the other thing I focus on early on theoretically is the idea of collective identity, creating identity. So guys like Al-Awlaki, as Ingram describes, is an architect of identity. They define it in a number of ways, and partly by defining what they are not, right? So it's about setting up boundaries between Muslims living in the West and the wider Western society. How do you set those boundaries up? How do you make them stable? And really he used classic Salafi jihadi or Salafi doctrines, particularly al-wala wal-bara, in the Western context to say, you know, our loyalty has to be to our fellow Muslims in the West, and we have to divide ourselves from the non-Muslim, but also I have to show you why these people are actually a threat to you. And he says, you know, you might think that, as he describes them, Joe Sixpack and Sally Soccer Mom next door aren't a threat to you. You know, you might do barbecues with them, you might carpool with them, they might be a colleague, but they're not Muslim. And I want you to believe that those people may one day want to kill you or be involved in some type of oppression of you. And it's quite a hard sell because, you know, that's not the experience that audience has had usually. So he's had to find examples again to say these people can be a threat to you. And one of the classic examples he used was the Bosnian genocide of Bosnian Muslims, by saying, actually, you know, it didn't take very much for that region to go from Muslim, non-Muslim living side by side to non-Muslims, if not overseeing, you know, passively supporting a genocide of Muslims on the doorstep of Europe, by the way, and for which very little was done to stop, right, until it was a little too late. So he was able to take those kind of and say, you know, those Muslims thought just like you about 20 years ago. They thought they were safe, and now they've been put in concentration, or they've been put in mass graves. So he was able to again bring that threat really home with stuff like that. Very effectively, and you know, create that sense through the storytelling as well. Identity really can be derived through this as well, which is how do you make all these people who have often different ethnicities, different backgrounds, different socioeconomic backgrounds, but the same religion, how do you make them feel very, very connected? And storytelling does that very, very well, especially because it gives people a sense of a shared history, a shared struggle, and a shared future that they can all come together, and a shared threat that they all face. And if you can make people feel part of that wider group and kind of discard their individual identities, you know, and he was able to kind of really convince people that individual identity is kind of a waste of time and a selfish endeavor as well, because it ignores the needs of the ummah. He was very effective at creating that identity and defining it, creating it, and disseminating it. And again, so you bring all that stuff together, the ability to create collective identity, the ability to frame threats in ways that are relevant and resonate with the audience, with an American audience specifically, there you have some pretty important ingredients for getting people to act. And I think you mentioned as well the issue of agency, right? And this is important because very rarely, up until quite late in his career, so when he was, you know, he joins Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula around 08, 09, and becomes much more kind of straightforward about saying what people should do and how they should go and kill someone. But on the whole, his work is actually defined by lack of direct threats or the, you know, or of calling for direct calls for violence. What he's much more effective at is presenting himself, using the legitimacy that he has in the eyes of his audience. You know, as you said, he wasn't really a scholar, and we can talk about his lack of qualifications. But for those who haven't looked, you know, for most people, they will see, okay, he was Imam at Dar al-Hijra, he was celebrated in the UK. The view is he's a legitimate, you know, actor here, a legitimate scholar. So what he would essentially say is, look, as a scholar, I'm giving you the objective truth about, or the objective story about Islam and the interpret. I'm giving you all the information objectively here, and you need to take that information and decide how to use it in context of the threats you're facing. So a classic example would be essentially his call to murder people who draw pictures of Muhammad, or the kind of Muhammad cartoons controversy, right? He was one of the first and still only jihadi preachers, even in any language, to make the case using hadith to justify the murder of cartoonists. And the way he did that was in the midst of the cartoon crisis controversies in the mid-2000s, he gives a live lecture. And the lecture bills itself as Islamic scholar explains to Western Muslims what basically they should think about this Muhammad cartoons issue. What should they do about it? And he says, look, I don't need to tell you, I'm not going to tell you what to do. All we need to do is look at what did the Prophet and his companions do. How did they react to this situation? And then you decide. And he decides on a hadith that tells the story of the killing of a Jewish poet, Ka'b ibn al-Ashraf, by a follower of Muhammad's, Muhammad bin Maslama. And it's a hadith that is not a disputed one, though his interpretation of it is questionable. And essentially he says, look, there's an example here. The Jewish poet, he was writing poems lamenting the victories that Muhammad was enjoying, and he had to shut that guy down and kill him. And he sent one of his followers to do it. And that's kind of where the talk ends. It doesn't end with saying, so here, brothers and sisters, go and he says, here's all the information, you decide. Yeah. So it's giving the illusion of agency when really he's conning you and manipulating everything. And there's quite, you know, that people, Rashad Ali has written about how that hadith has been kind of, has been misinterpreted, perhaps not quite the role, but has been selectively presented. And essentially the argument is that Ashraf was not just a poet, he was also a spy, or I think he was acting, you know, in a much more physical way against, you know, as an enemy rather than simply a writer or a poet. So anyway, but you know, but these are issues that are difficult to deal with. It's not a disputed hadith. You know, this is it's not one of those that are thought to be made up. So that creation, that making you feel like you've been furnished with all the information, and now in the context of a modern situation as well, right? In the context of the Muhammad cartoons controversy, here's all the relevant, you know, objective information on what Islam says. You decide, and so that. Giving that illusion of agency was a very effective thing that he did. It was subtle, you know. Rarely was it a direct incitement to murder. And I think I saw a question on there about YouTube. This partly explains why he was so hard to get rid of on social media and on platform, because most of the stuff, unless you're really listening and you had the kind of the background, or you were a jihadist yourself, you may not have picked up on him actually really inciting murder, you know.
Yeah, and I actually had that in one of my notes when I was reading the book. It says the subtlety that you mentioned as an example. You were mentioning the Prophet Muhammad cartoons, where it's like a subtle call to arms without direct incitement. Which again, we have two questions that I think are really good questions. I think maybe I would like to leave them for in a few minutes. Maybe we'll get to the part where we talk about, maybe I'd like to get your thoughts, and I know probably a lot of people on the call would like to get your thoughts on, well, how do you counter somebody like that? I mean, you've spent all this time kind of studying him and studying his effects and how he was able to do all of this stuff. Well, how do you reverse engineer it to kind of, you know, make him less effective, or do the same thing that he did actually, but to a better, you know, for a better cause or whatever. So I'd love to get to that in a couple of minutes. And the two questions that we have relate to that. But I quickly just, I wanted to, because you do such a good job talking about three very specific examples of Americans or Westerners, three Muslims in the West who were really taken by Al-Awlaki's incitement and really, you know, heeded that call. And, you know, just as a quick side note, I mean, what I think is so fascinating is for him to be able to do that to Muslims in the West is also kind of additionally interesting, I guess, or more difficult to do, because the Western culture is not necessarily naturally predicated on collectivism. I mean, you know, people in the West are very much taught to fight for their individual rights and their own happiness. And, you know, it's not really a very collective type of society. So the fact that he was able to make people rethink their individualism and to put it, you know, second, I think was really powerful. So you talk about three Muslims in the West: Omar Farouk, Abdul Muttalib, Nidal Hassan, and Zachary Chesser. You say who, at least in part, were all influenced by Al-Awlaki to become involved in the global jihad movement. But they all followed different paths, right? So one, you say Abdul Muttalib was a more traditionalist path, where he actually traveled to Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, AQAP territory in Yemen, and received training and then tried to come back and commit an attack here, or to return to the West. And then Nidal Hassan, obviously we all know him, military guy, and actually decided to do something in his own home on the military base as a lone actor. And then Chesser was a propagandist in the US, and then tried to leave the US and go join Al-Shabaab, but was arrested before he could do so. So three very different cases, but you say that all three of them were inspired by Al-Awlaki. So I'm interested to hear, I mean, is it that his message was so universal that you could kind of make it your own, and that it was kind of a one-size-fits-all thing? Or, you know, how is it that he was able to inspire three such different courses of action?
Yeah, so as I said, the first half of the book is the intellectual history of Al-Awlaki, and then then the kind of second half, I suppose, or maybe the second third more accurately, it's more like three parts. The third looking at his kind of influence after his death, and yeah, so I choose these three cases, you know, specifically because each represents a different type of jihadist mobilization in the West. As you mentioned, Omar Farouk Abdul Muttalib, the infamous aborted or attempted underwear bomber, Christmas Day 2009. You know, as you mentioned, he went to Al-Qaeda, he trained with them ideologically and military or militant training, and, you know, was given a real bomb, a proper bomb built by a professional bomb maker. He was kind of more of the pro-terrorist that we actually see, you know, a bit less of in the West. So that's the reason I chose him. You know, the story in the chapter on Omar Farouk Abdul Muttalib kind of tries to explain, you know, as you said, it's the book says that they were influenced at least in part by Al-Awlaki. I don't want to ever make the claim that he's solely responsible for this. That was far too simplistic. But what he had tried to do in each chapter is tease out what it is that Al-Awlaki contributed to that person's decision-making within a wider set of influences that they are experiencing or in the thrall of.
Mm-hmm.
And in each case, you usually are seeing the issue, and this often ignored, just the pure question of timing. When did they come across him? What was going on in their lives when they did come across him?
Right.
What was it that made them open to I don't love using the word vulnerable because it kind of takes away agency, but what I'm getting at, I can use it in this context in the sense that what was it that was making them susceptible or vulnerable to what he was selling? And each time you can see moments in their lives. With Abdul Muttalib, it was this sort of very conservative Salafi Nigerian who kind of Western educated, moves to London with a strong theological commitment to Islam. It was a very conservative Salafi, but not very activist, not very political. He goes to London in a moment in the mid to late 2000, the last decade, when there was a lot of Islamist activism taking place and a lot of anger among British Muslims about the Iraq War, about Guantanamo Bay, about Diego Garcia, the rendition, all that kind of stuff was going on. And there was a lot of Islamist movements and groups that were exploiting that tension for their own gains to further divide and recruit. And so Muttalib comes in and he immediately is kind of faced with this issue that actually he's never really thought about implementing Islam politically. And so that's the milieu in which he injects himself, this sort of student activist Islamic society milieu of the time, according to him in interviews that he gave to the FBI after his arrest, that I rely on partly in the book. He says that's what everyone was reading. That's who everyone was referring to Al-Awlaki at the time. So he comes across him at this moment. And it's Al-Awlaki who sells to him the idea that actually it's not just about what you believe, but it's about what you do. And you have to back it up with action. And so that chapter tries to extrapolate a bit more about, and a lot of interesting little details that weren't known about before, largely thanks to these documents, these FBI interviews. And for him, it was Al-Awlaki specifically he had to go meet. In order to, he wanted to do something in furtherance of the cause of the Ummah, but it was only really one person he trusted to tell him how and what to do. And really, it's crazy, but he specifically says, really, he essentially gave himself up to Al-Awlaki, as a vessel, almost saying, do with me what you will. Tell me what to do and I'll do it. Tell me how to do it and I'll do it. It was really something. And so he needed that direct contact, he couldn't have just been inspired from afar. He needed something more in his case. And so he went, meets him, trains with Al-Qaeda in the Peninsula, meets a couple of other fairly interesting figures. But so that's the Muttalib case. And with Nidal Hassan, the Fort Hood shooter, so army psychologist at the time, goes on a shooting spree. He's a separate he's another type of category of jihadist mobilization. That's specifically the more lone actor, right? No organizational connections to any jihadi group, no real involvement in any real world or even barely online milieu of extremists or Islamists, or jihadists, no real, no connections at all of that type. And he picks up a gun and he goes and he kills, I think, 13 service men and women that day. So with him, the moment that's noticeable with him is the death of his mother. And in fact, who do you think presided over the funeral rites for his mother? Anwar Al-Awlaki at the Darul Hijra Mosque in Virginia, where he was based. So that tells you a lot right there. This moment in his life, this very traumatic moment for him specifically. He's very close to his mother. Her death is very jarring. He also, and a colleague of mine at Program on Extremism at the time, a fantastic researcher called Catherine Popp, had also interviewed Nidal Hassan while I was working with her, and she was very kindly allowed me to be involved in that process and shared with me the interviews, and I was also able to ask questions through her, and she shared with me also the unpublished interviews that she didn't use in her own work. And really there it comes across that he had come to this belief that his parents had sinned in their lives. They owned a corner store, I think, alcohol, liquor store. They sold alcohol, And he basically had this fear that his mother died in sin and was going to go to hell, as was his father. And he had in his mind that he had to make up for their sins. He had to find ways to do it. And this moved him more closely to his religion. And in the process of him researching his faith, he thinks again about that preacher that presided over his mother's funeral rites. And he turns to him, and it's his work that inspires him the most. But the thing to keep in mind as well, it's not just the jihadi work that gets them. It's the more wider religious stuff that, so if you ask Nidal Hasan, what's your favorite of Al-Awlaki's work? It's not Constance on the Path of Jihad or all that. It's Lives of the Prophets.
Right.
It's his ability. It's actually the wider Islamic discussions that most interest. And one of the things that Nidal Hasan says about Al-Awlaki's work, he said, he explained to me what the war on Islam looked like. Just what I was telling you earlier about how it wasn't just this foreign military endeavor. He said, I started seeing the war on Islam in places in the world, or in my life, that I hadn't noticed before. And the thing to keep in mind with recruitment radicalization is we talk a lot about the role of grievances, right? About people have underlying grievances that are exploited by extremist groups. And absolutely that's the case. Many, you find things that you can exploit in the experiences of a community or of an individual. But what's often ignored is how the best type of recruiters can generate grievances where they weren't before. So it's about identifying problems in that person's life that person wasn't aware of until it was pointed out. Exactly. And so, for example, the ideological war on Islam, this debate that's in the media and in governments and in academia about moderate Islam and all that, framed very simply for Nidal Hasan as another example of the war on Islam. So he himself says, it's Al-Awlaki, he really explained to me what that war looked like and why it mattered to me, and why I had to do something about it. But yeah, go ahead.
Quickly, because we have 4 questions I want to make.
Okay. Yeah, go to the questions. Yeah.
Okay, so I think a couple of them. Okay, so let me go with a quick one from Milo Comerford. Hi, Milo. He said, I'm really excited about the book. Did you find a clear moment of transition? We have 4 questions, so we'll try to get through them in the 10 minutes. So Milo says, did you find a clear moment of transition between a Salafi activist and a Salafi jihadi Awlaki, or was this transition less clear cut?
Yeah. You want to read all the questions?
Yeah, why don't I do that? And the other 2 questions that I think, there are 2 questions that I think are more sort of like in the prescriptive kind of category. So one is, do you think that any counter narratives have been effective at defining an alternative identity for Muslims in the West? Has anybody really been able to do what he's done? Obviously, but to the opposite effect. And related to that, do you think that it was about the YouTube? Do you think it was right to ban the videos of Al-Awlaki on YouTube, regardless of their content, so even if they weren't inciting? And do you think it should be done for other extremist preachers too? So again, moving forward, how do you do? And then the other 2, one is from Ahmad al-Din Ahmed. Do you see parallels between Ka'b ibn al-Ashraf and Anwar al-Awlaki in that both are propagandists whose execution has been somewhat justified on somewhat similar grounds? And then finally, do you see Awlaki's charisma in any current figure? Is there a living heir for Al-Awlaki in Al-Qaeda? Mm-hmm. So I'll let you get
yeah.
We have.
So on, thanks. So on Milo's question, thanks Milo for tuning in. I hope the book's useful. No, I wouldn't say there's a moment, but I think that certainly the American society and government politics response to 9/11 was, for him, the way he viewed it, was for him a confirmation that the threat was so severe that the only way to really respond was to fight. As far as his work, I think the work that is the first real signal would probably be a work that he translated when he was in his time in the UK. And just to give a quick history, he started in America, moved to London in around 2003, and then moved to Yemen in around 04, I think, 04 or 05, I think 04, and then spent the rest of his life there. So in the UK, he one of the things he does is gives an oral translation of the book of Jihad by a medieval scholar called Ibn Nahas. A strange decision, because we're not talking about a book that was making a major scholarly contribution to Western Muslims' understanding of their faith. It was really a book that was designed to justify jihad as a violent endeavor above all else, not a spiritual, non-violent one or sort of inner struggle. No, it was a book that very specifically in that medieval context wanted to explain why the Quran and Hadith made it very clear that jihad was a physical, violent endeavor. And Al-Awlaki chooses to translate this at a time, and as I said, in the UK, that was a pretty tough time in terms of the relationship between the state and British Muslims, in terms of how British Muslims felt at the time, much more under threat, under the spotlight. He decides that that's the moment to go and translate this in London. And in fact, one of the things I found out in the course of my research was he would give these lectures, these translations, in usually closed-door meetings. And I spoke to someone who attended one of those meetings, and in the audience, I think this was one in Birmingham, were two of the future 7/7 bombers, you know. But these were the kind of people who were listening to him at the time. And there was also, I spoke to Muslims, you know, who were active and working at the time, who were warning against him then, by warning about what he was doing in these closed-door meetings, how he was justifying suicide bombing, how he was justifying jihad. So I think that moment in London, the book of Jihad is probably the closest you'll get to at least an open admission of where he was. The counter narratives, you know, I always get this question. I rarely have a very good answer. I'm you know, usually you got to spend your time figuring out one of two things: what the problem is or how to solve it. I have to say I spent most of my time figuring out what the problem is and what it looks like. And the truth is as well, when it comes to solving it, you know, you have hard and soft powers, both of which have been deployed a lot, much more hard than soft. But, you know, the whole counter issue, the CVE, countering violent extremism question, counter narratives, is one of the classic responses. Say we need to come up with a way to sell the religion or sell sort of certain interpretations of the religion that undo or undermine, you know, the jihadist one. And frankly, it's something that no one's really succeeded very well in doing, I think. I know it's a field that you've studied and talked about a lot. I'd be interested to see what you thought. But in general, the sense is that, at least especially when it's coming from the state level, the counter narrative is struggles to be effective. And to be honest, I haven't seen anyone do a great job of specifically undoing Al-Awlaki. There are some who have done it theologically, but if you want to read the theological, you know, critiques of Al-Awlaki, you have to really sit down and spend time with it. It's not something that's as accessible. There's no as accessible version, you know. And the thing is, the whole point is, you know, the counter narrative is always going to be loaded with the fact that you know it's there for a reason, which is it's there as a response to something. So it's never going to be able to sell itself as being completely legitimate, because you know why it's really there. It's there as a reaction. And as long as something is there as a reaction, it's never going to be all that effective. And I think the best people on counter narratives and CVE make that point, you know, is that, you know, it cannot be a purely reactive thing. It can't be something that we're doing as, okay, let's figure out how to react to Al-Awlaki. No, that doesn't seem to be the way it's worked, and it hasn't worked. As far the next question was the YouTube question, right? Yes, I did think so. You know, I generally consider myself a free speech absolutist. I don't really want to curtail speech very much, and even in the case of Al-Awlaki, I had to wrestle with that a bit. But you know, incitement to murder is the line that usually you cross in order to have your speech restricted, in my view. In Al-Awlaki's case, the incitement to murder was subtle, you know, but it was clear enough. You know, it was one of those where I had to kind of readjust and figure out that this subtlety is a very clever way of playing on the laws and the norms that we have in the West that they're able to exploit. And so the Muhammad cartoons sermon is one of the best examples, and that you could find on YouTube for so long because it didn't have any obvious problem. One of the issues with the initial YouTube approach was they didn't look at the individual as a whole who was on their platform. They looked at what are they saying in this lecture? What's he saying here? Not what has he said? We don't really care about what he said, not on our platform. What's he saying here? They had to change that. They have changed that approach. Now they take it as a whole, and say, okay, he may not say this in this video, but what has he said more widely? But even in that case, with the Muhammad cartoon stuff, even that was hard. They had to over time, and they have made big experts there now, people who do understand this stuff and who can read between the lines. So in that process, YouTube were able to kind of get on top of it and remove it. So I did think they had to remove him. And the other thing to keep in mind, for your average person who's not following all this stuff, coming across something on YouTube can feel like a sort of legitimizing thing. It's like, people can say, well, he's on YouTube, how bad can it be? How marginal can it be? He's on this mainstream platform. So it helps bolster someone's credibility just by having him on these mainstream platforms. And that is another thing I think they've accepted and done a great, pretty good job of undoing. Parallels with Ka'b ibn al-Ashraf, I have never thought of it like that, to be honest. I think more widely on the issue of Al-Awlaki's killing, it's probably a topic we can do a whole event on. Very quick, my general position, I don't discuss it very much in the book, but is that it was an incredibly difficult decision that probably had to be made because what we know now is that Al-Awlaki was operationally involved. Even at the time he was killed, now we've seen there's multiple other live plots he was involved in. And in fact, since he's died, we've had plots play out that he was involved in, including the shooting at the Charlie Hebdo magazine, the magazine that was most famous for the Muhammad cartoons, depictions of Muhammad. The Kouachi brothers who went and murdered the satirist in that office, one of them was sent partly by Al-Awlaki and funded by Al-Awlaki. So we're talking about someone who was an operational terrorist, who was difficult to arrest, was living in a pretty lawless terrain where the writ of the government didn't exist. It was a very hard decision, but probably just about the right one. The last one was this is another common question. Is there another Al-Awlaki? Probably the closest you'll get is Abdullah Al-Faisal, Jamaican cleric, who is now, I think, about to be extradited to America from Jamaica, has a long history in the UK as well, a very important figure in the Jihad story in the West. But you'll be very hard pressed to recreate Al-Awlaki because, as I said, he had this image of being mainstream. He was on all the news networks. He was at the Pentagon. You're not going to get someone who is today a member of Al-Qaeda or a member of ISIS, who used to be, regarded by a huge amount of people as legitimate mainstream voice. So, it's very hard to reproduce that, as well as all the circumstances that made him who he was, including the War on Terror era, 9/11, all that stuff. You're not going to be able to recreate all those ingredients to get that level of legitimacy and reach again. But Abdullah Faisal, Ahmad Musa Jibril, actually probably I would say is the closest, because he does a lot more wider discussion of Islam, and he has a great charisma, and he's a free man now in the United States. But someone who actually ICSR and its director Shiraz Meher identified years ago as being a very important figure in recruiting, or at least inspiring Brits and Westerners to join ISIS. So probably those two, if I was to be pressed on it.
All right, Alex. Well, that was perfectly timed because we have one more minute left. So thank you for. I just want to take the last minute to thank everybody for joining, to thank you for taking this time out of your day to talk to us about your book. One thing that I wanted to highlight that you said in your book, you said, if radicalization matters, then the story of Al-Awlaki and his followers must be center stage. And that's not just for what he did before, but for what he continues to do and how he continues to be an ongoing source of inspiration and an ongoing reference for so many people. So for that reason, because it is so relevant and remains relevant, I really hope that people will pick up the book. I have it right here. It was a great read. Alex, thank you so much. Thanks to ICSR for having us. Thanks to everybody for joining. And I do hope you will pick up a copy of the book and give it a read. I really enjoyed it. So thanks again, Alex.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for joining. You're a great host, Jasmine. So hopefully I'll have you do a couple more of these.
Inshallah.
All right.
Thanks.
See ya. Thanks. Bye.